Hi, everyone. I'm John Kasparian, the Interim Dean of the School of Architecture, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you today, or should I say, welcome back after the catastrophic last week that we had. I do hope that everyone, at least in Texas, is warm and safe, and that the damage done is at least somewhat manageable for all. Our spring lecture series, New Proximities, is focused on a collective reckoning of health as a social, political, and spatial condition precipitated by the current global pandemic. I would like to thank our faculty student committee, which also includes Maria Nicanor of RDA, chaired by assistant professors, Professor Brittany Udding and Wortham Fellow Amlin Ng, for organizing the series, and all the staff who assisted, particularly Christine Worley, our event specialists. Brittany and Amlin will provide a more detailed introduction at the next lecture in early March. In addition to the committee's selection, I have asked 3 faculty to add their voice in the continuing series of faculty talks, renamed strangely enough from Noon Talk to Faculty Talk. The first of these talks by Associate Professor Troy Sham, which was scheduled last week, Monday the 15th of February, and canceled due to the effects of the weather calamity, is now rescheduled on Monday, March 22nd. So please make note of the change. On another program note, I would also like to remind you that next Tuesday, a symposium organized by Assistant Professor Brittany Udding will be held, with a concluding keynote address on Wednesday evening by Silvia Federici, who was featured yesterday in the New York Times Magazine. But now to today's talk. The impetus for these presentations was the realization that even in a small school like ours, now made even more apparent during these virtual times, many of us, particularly students, are not so familiar with the specific research or professional activities of our faculty. And so in this sense, these are introductory lectures. Of course, with today's speaker, Gus Sessions' Wortham professor, Albert Pope, our most renowned, influential, and distinguished faculty member, this is hardly the case. His seminal and groundbreaking book, Ladders of 1997, set a new direction of thought about urbanism and the urban context, with both the original version and the 2015 update going out of print, so both bestsellers. In recent years, Albert has applied his expertise to investigations on climate change, with research studios and seminars on carbon reduction and flood mitigation. His current graduate studio on the legacies of the New Deal of the 1930s and its relation to the proposed Green New Deal, focusing on infrastructural change, including the implications such as wind farms, couldn't be more apt after a week of climatic havoc. So it is indeed my pleasure to present my learned friend and esteemed colleague, Albert Pope.
Thanks a lot, John, for the introduction. It was a lot less painful than I thought it would be. For those of you who aren't here in Houston, maybe some of you are from other places. Last week, 52% of the city was without power for 48 hours plus in 11-degree weather. And even now we're still boiling water. I didn't think I could really start this talk without making some reference to that. And I think the conclusion, I mean, it's all too familiar, although maybe not this extreme, But the obvious conclusion is that unregulated markets can't produce a civil society. I don't care what it is, a capital market, a real estate market, an energy market. By civil society, I basically just mean ontological security, food, water, shelter, health, and maybe something like dignity. But we know that there are alternatives to this because we have found and exercised those alternatives before. John mentioned the studio. I had this fancy introduction and I changed it last minute. These are just the first 2 pages of my studio brief for the semester, which refers to the TVA. For those of you who don't know the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority project, it really was one of the most remarkable aspects of the New Deal. And I think largely the Green New Deal is built on it. For one thing, the TVA was green, it's hydropower, but it was a lot more. It generated power, it controlled erosion, flooding, it pursued best farming practices, it provided community infrastructure. It was a really comprehensive project that, while all projects of this scale and scope have their failings, it's in large part an enormous success. And the reason I want to start with this has to do with the scale of this project. And referring to the title of this lecture, which is Promethean Increment, this is the Promethean part. And there's this quote that I started out with, which is full of trigger words. I'm wondering how relevant it still is. But I do think, I hope that some of this remains, and some of this remains in the substance of the Green New Deal. It's very short. There's something in the mere cant of a dam when seen from below that makes one think of the pyramids of Egypt. Both pyramid and dam represent an architecture of power, but the difference is notable and should make one prouder of being an American. The first grew out of slavery and celebrated death. That was the Egyptians. Ours was produced by free labor, energy, and life for the people of the United States. So setting aside the nationalism and other maybe problematic things about the statement, I really would like to hold on to the fact that the scale and scope and the power of this project is really within our reach. I would argue that we're not going to get out of the environmental problems that we have without addressing this scale. So in my mind, the TVA stands for this concerted effort at scale, almost a wartime scale, served in this case to solve the energy problems in rural America. It was an electrification project, for those of you who don't know. What we're doing this semester is we're taking the idea and moving it to West Texas. It turns out that the most productive counties in terms of energy, wind energy, the counties that produce the most energy, wind energy, are also some of the poorest in the state. That is totally off. Part of the TVA was the notion that some of the proceeds from the resources that are extracted from a given area can remain in that area and should remain in that area and be the basis for a rejuvenation of that area. In the terms of the United States, the with wrecked rural economies everywhere, that couldn't be a more obvious move. And as I was saying, this is where I think we know we can do this because we've done it before. And I think the prospects obviously are better than they have been in a long time. given the change in governance that we've had in the last month. And I think this is exactly why the New Deal was used as a primary reference for the Green New Deal, is that we have been here before, that we have, as a government at scale, dealt with the issues of precarity. What I'm going to show you today, and I have to go really quick because it was hard for me to edit my slides as usual. So I'm going to talk fast. This is like an Aaron Sorkin script. You have to keep up in order just to get through this in 45 minutes. What I want to show you is some work we've done in a degree program that I run here called Present Future. It's been running since 2015. As John mentioned, it's dealing with climate change, climate disruption. More recently, it's been dealing with the flooding up until the semester of 2017, and Hurricane Harvey, and the fact that Houston has over 100,000 buildings in the 100-year floodplain, and that's a problem that we need to address head on. I mean, this just like the collapse in the energy infrastructure last weekend, this is a problem of precarity that has solutions if we only put them forward in a timely fashion, in a time in which the possibility of their realization actually exists. So this is, again, for those of you outside of Houston, you may not know the extent of Harvey. This is a powerful image taken from the Sam Houston Tollway of a commercial artery, a strip, during the flood. And there has been a sort of guiding principle that I was just in Present Future that I was just referring to in the Mumford quote, but I think it's stated more clearly here. And I'm going to kick this off with a little bit of reading. I hope you don't mind. They're pretty punchy quotes, and this is from Bruno Latour, talking about the scope and scale of the environmental problems that we're facing and how that relates to modernism. And I would add specifically modern architecture, modern urbanism. There's something deeply troubling about the many ecological demands to suddenly restrict ourselves and try to leave no more footprints on a planet we've nevertheless already modified through and through. It appears totally implausible to ask the heirs of an emancipatory tradition of modernism to convert suddenly to an attitude of abstinence, caution, and asceticism, especially when billions of people still aspire to a minimum of decent existence and comfort. It may not be the time to sound the retreat and to betray the progressive ethos of modernism by suddenly becoming ascetics. If modernism was Promethean in its time, the massive acceleration of a green economy and clean technologies that scientists argue is needed would be Prometheus squared. Yet it is still unquestionable that there's something deeply flawed in the hubristic tone of so much hype about technological solutions to ecological crisis. Is there a way to explore a more positive and energetic and innovative set of passions to repair and pursue the modernist experience at a more fundamental level? Can we imagine a Dr. Frankenstein who would not flee in horror at the creature he bungled at first? I'm thinking about modern urbanism, something that was bungled at first, but a Frankenstein who goes back to his laboratory. Can Prometheus be reconciled with the seemingly antithetical notions of care and caution? The notion of a Promethean increment it's a little oxymoronic. Promethean is large in scale and scope. large enough to deal with the scale and scope of the problems that we're facing. Increment and incrementalism is really the opposite of that, where you're dealing at one step at a time. And I think it's the paradox of that, the fact that we don't have the tools and maybe don't want to have the tools to make these huge interventions. How can we take the smaller increments, let's say a building, that we are capable that we do have control over, and giving them outsized effects, Promethean effects. So the great acceleration, a lot of these slides, I think by now, I've had them for a couple of years, but I think most people know about the environmental problems. These are just slides to kind of bring us onto the same page. The great acceleration is these hockey stick diagrams that really charted the beginning of our problems, not at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, but actually in the 1950s. And you can see the line here: species extinction, GDP, paper consumption, international tourism, rainforest loss, domesticated land, atmospheric CO2. These are the natural indicators: nitrous oxide, ozone depletion, coastal nitrogen. Throw in there telephones. And you've got this enormous uptick of resource expenditure, resource extraction, and production that we have all very much benefited from, and which is really the cause of our problems. We can't look at the smaller scale effects. We need, despite the fact that we may need to work at a smaller scale, we have to address this larger scale. There's this idea in environmental circles called the technosphere. If you've heard of it, my last quick reading, a 2017 study estimated the mass of the global technosphere, the material habitat that humans have created in support of the species: massive fleets of cars and airplanes, continental expansions of managed landscapes, billions of buildings, and the physical and electronic infrastructure that supports it all. It weighs in at 30 trillion tons, some 5 times the weight of the human beings that it sustains. I don't know how scientists weigh this, but the estimate was in the article Nature, in the journal Nature. It carries some weight. That is approximately 4,000 tons of transformed Earth per human being, or 27 tons of technosphere for each pound of a 150-pound person. A virtual exoskeleton for the species. Everything we do through the technosphere. Prepare a meal, buy a shirt, message a colleague, fill a prescription, or simply bathe. In spite of their importance to basic survival, these activities and the familiar objects that enable them come to be perceived as threats to that survival. As it turns out, just being human and alive in the world today requires a significant carbon expenditure that cannot be simply sloughed off. This is by way of implicating ourselves in the problems that we're facing. And the scope at which we need to be thinking. One of the things that the technosphere gives us is a description, a global description of our problem. And I could formulate it as follows: that the technosphere, it's following the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, the biosphere, the atmosphere. These are global systems, natural systems, to which we have added our own, the technosphere. The problem, obviously, at a global scale is this technosphere is not integrated into the other spheres. It is, in fact, throwing them out of balance, and wrecking them at a remarkable rate. This is the sort of combined effect, and just in order not to to leave us all in despair, I had to throw in the world population growth rate, which is an incredibly interesting indicator that I found somewhat later from Stuart Brand's whole earth discipline, or whole earth discipline. What's happening is the population is still going up, but in 1963, it reached a peak of 2% a year and has since been falling drastically. Not the population, but the rate of growth. The Malthusian premise has been proven wrong since 1963, when the rate of population growth reached a frightening 2% a year, but began dropping. And the 1963 inflection point showed that the imagined soaring J curve of human increase was instead a normal S curve. The growth rate was leveling off. No one thought that the growth rate might go negative and the population start shrinking in this century without an overshoot and a crash, but that is what is happening. Which is to say, we are confronting an incredibly complex and wicked problem, full of contradictions, and not without potential solutions, not yet beyond our ability to productively grapple with. This is our piece of the technosphere here in Houston. This is the energy corridor, Interstate 10 West. It happens to be the widest freeway in the world. And it's almost always crowded. In other words, 25 lanes is not enough. There's a technical reason for this. It increases, the more you build demand. But the upshot here is that this type of urbanization has no future. I can't see another way around it, despite the baldness of that statement. The bottom left-hand corner shows a diagram, and the vertical axis, it's energy expenditure. And on the horizontal axis from left to right, it's decreasing density. So you have Hong Kong predictably at one corner of the scale, the graph, and Houston and Phoenix at the other extreme corner of the graph. The connection between dispersion, urban dispersion, and energy consumption is undeniably clear. That there is no question about the surplus that we are paying, energy surplus and emission surplus that we're paying to produce a city that like the one we have produced. And it, again, needing to confront it for what it is. The stuff on the left is a pretty interesting study by the Cool Climate Network at the University of California, Berkeley. And what this is carbon emission by zip code. And the green is as you might imagine, the lower carbon emissions. The red is the higher carbon emissions. And what you see exactly in the Northeast, using the term buswash, which is the megalopolitan region between Boston and Washington, the lowest emissions occur in the pre-1950 development of New York City, basically within the 5 boroughs and pieces of New Jersey, where the emissions are lowest. This is a sort of graphic indictment. If you look, I just have a piece of the megalopolis in the upper left-hand corner. That stretch of red goes all the way up and down the seaboard, as again a way to understand, and a need to understand this type of urbanism and the effects of its dispersion. On the right is Corbusier, modern urbanism, in some ways to the rescue. In some ways are promoting or responsible for this condition. or having promoted the condition we find ourselves in now, but at the same time, in many ways, providing a solution. Radiant city urbanism is in fact one of the most dense urbanisms, often far more dense than what we would normally perceive as a dense environment, which is New York. That's Corbusier's drawing at the upper right-hand corner, talking about, to the horror of everyone, including myself, the removal of Manhattan and its replacement with radiant city towers, a diagram he made in 1935. The diagram on the left just shows a little bit more per capita of the per capita consumption of energy and emissions, with United States running at the top, more than double the rate of Europe and Japan. But down at the bottom, if you look at the world average, which is kind of where we need to get, you see another city, Hong Kong, because it was ranked as a country. We get to see the effect of density on per capita consumption and emission. So what we're looking at is a kind of solution in the form of urban density, capable of taking our environmental footprint down considerably, 70, 75%. The only problem being is we don't have a contemporary model of density, at least not one that we accept, given the problems of radiant city planning, the little diagram there, the towers in the park. How do we think through what urban density means today? We cannot simply go back and try to reconstruct Midtown Manhattan, and for reasons that I'll be more clear about in a second. And this second, where are we as a discipline urbanistically? Well, we're kind of backwards and forwards. These are three projects, one by OMA, one by Foster and Partners, and one by Piano. The first one is the Waterfront City in Dubai. Second one is Masdar, the famous Masdar Zero Carbon City that was started in 2007 and has since been terminated. And then the Daimler-Platz in Berlin of 2000 by Piano Workshop. All three of these architects are fairly progressive. In other words, they are at the cutting edge of material and technical exploration. Building skins, the material research, environmental research. They are pushing the envelope as far as building technology is concerned, and at least with regard to Foster and Piano, that's their MO, right? That is not only what they do, it's how their buildings become the expression of that advanced technique. What's going on here in these three examples is really the opposite. The Manhattan, the waterfront city in Dubai, is based on a sort of image of Manhattan Island floating in between the East and the Hudson Rivers and the boroughs on the outside. The centerpiece is obviously a chunk of Manhattan. This is a souk standing in for one of the boroughs. These are I think are called Miami. They're replicating different pieces and parts of the urban environment and reproducing them. Foster is talking about, the quote, inspired by the architecture and urban planning of traditional Arab cities, Masdar City incorporates narrow streets, shading of windows, exterior walls and walkways, thick-walled buildings, courtyard and wind towers. Foster is an absolute disciple of Buckminster Fuller. We can only ask him how much those thick-walled buildings weigh. And then the last one is the Daimler-Platz by Piano. who remarks, with its surface area of 600,000 square meters, the scheme has the dimension of a small town. Like a village, it's designed around a piazza, the focal point of the project. Why are these forward-looking architects looking backwards when it comes to urbanism? And why do we accept this split in between architecture and urbanism, where it doesn't matter if there's a continuity that exists? We can refer to the past 1 minute, refer to the future another minute. All three examples are large super projects that are designed by a single hand, yet imitate a traditional aggregate urbanism. They are master plan imitations of cities that were aggregated over relatively long periods of time. These are images of sort of frozen images of cities that were otherwise built by an entirely different means than the single hand of a master plan. Each example is the product of a high-end economy. Each uses the economic surplus to produce a hyperarticulate massing that seeks to emulate traditional urban fabric. Each example celebrates the postmodern split between architecture and urbanism. Each example attempts to revive grid-based typology nearly 70 years after its demise. So one of the things I would like to say in looking at our cities as the source and solution of our environmental problems, where do we start? Do we start in the past? Do we start in the future? What is our point of departure at this particular moment? I'm not going to go over the structure, the DNA of contemporary urbanism. I'm sick of doing it. I've been doing it for 20 years. It's the basis of the book that John mentioned, Ladders, where the spine-based urbanism of the periphery is really the dominant mode of urbanization today. And if we're going to start anywhere, we need to start with the logic of the predominant mode of urbanization and begin to develop it in ways that answer or respond to the environmental problems that we are facing. This is the reality. 75% of the built environment is now spine-based. So in the Houston, this is outside the loop. Any city circa 1950. In France, in Paris, this is the périphérique. 20% of the population of Paris lives inside the périphérique, the area that we know of as Paris. The rest of it's spine-based. This is a necessary point of departure for thinking through what might pass today as a model for urban reform. What I want to show you is two projects very quickly that deal with, take on the larger issues, the issues of urban reform, but do so in a way that is not master planned or is in some ways different from the three projects I just showed you. They're all based on the spine-based development, and they respond to a specific problem, but they don't respond with a totalizing gesture of a master plan where we're just replanning the city of Houston. They respond with through an incremental unit, an incremental response. So the first one I'd like to talk about is called Westbury Retreat. Present future, we've been doing a number of retreats since the storm in 2017. And we use the word retreat because of the 100,000 houses in the floodplains that we have. Plus, it's a more general term of what we're going to be needing to do in cities all around the world with the almost built-in inevitability of sea level rise. We're going to need to undesign or reverse design cities in order to pull back in an orderly fashion from these newly exposed waterfront properties everywhere. we're using the Houston as an example and a sort of test case for how do you do that? How do you pull back? So Westbury is a subdivision of Houston that has it's a tributary of the main bayou, which is called Brays Bayou, which is our most urban and most disastrous bayou in the city. You can see it in the middle of the slide there. The flood extents are in light gray. The floodplain is in dark gray. It is a big chunk of that 100,000 structures that are existing in the floodplain. It's also where the university is located, for those of you who don't know. There is a remarkable, wonderful, just recently completed project, Willow Waterhole. For those of you who haven't gone out there, you must go see it, which is a model, a contemporary model, as opposed to what we have done so far, which is really turn our bayous into storm drains, right? Into storm sewers by concreting them. A more modern and contemporary way of floodwater management that combines it with open space, so that while you're retreating from the dangerous parts of the landscape, this used to be a large industrial tract with some multifamily housing around it. While you're retreating, you're not only providing for getting people out of harm's way by pulling them out of the floodplain, you're also producing a potentially extraordinary urban space in the process. Fortunately, this is the exception and not the rule. In Westbury, very close to the Willow Waterhole. This probably doesn't mean much to you. This is where the Willow Waterhole is, and these gold rectangles that you can see in the slide are the multifamily housing, and it makes sense the multifamily housing is there in the sort of mind of Houston. Multifamily housing equals low income, and in this case it was true, built around the industrial area. Now, by a wonderful stroke of poetic justice, they are adjacent to the waterhole, but the building types, the buildings are falling apart, and the type is just, multifamily housing in Houston is just the worst. I don't care where you go. And those are two examples at the top, and the photographs around them. They are barracks, right? You know, some are turned at right angle degrees from another, but there are pitiful examples of the built environment, what multifamily housing could be. Largely what we do is we look at this smaller scale with the larger scale in mind and think through what makes sense incrementally. In terms of thinking through the next generation of structures in Houston. As structures phase out and are rebuilt, what should we rebuild them as? This is our typological approach, where we're combining a slab and shed, and this is our first increment. This is what we start with architecture. And thinking through not just a single solution in Westbury, but a typical solution, which gets us thinking about type and variation. The type is a slab and shed, and the variations you can see on the left-hand side that come from that. This is a distinctly modern typology where it's a podium can be either a commercial floor plate or a parking garage or a public space. These big horizontal long span spaces didn't exist in the traditional city, which is why we don't see why you can't put Walmart in Manhattan. Traditional urbanism can't accommodate these so-called blockbusters, yet we need to deal with them. This seemed like the sort of base form that we could start with. As a replacement type, this would easily take the place, it's about 20 stories, of a one of the multifamily housing developments that I just showed you in a more compact footprint, less density, less energy expenditure, less carbon emissions. This is a present future project from 2018. And Ray Chang, Eric Chung, Charlie Fu, and Xing Yu Wen were really responsible for this project. I should say their name on every slide because it's really owing to their industry that we're able to do any of this stuff. This is a model that we use, which I'm going to explain very quickly. For those of you who don't know it, it's an apartment in Japan by Seijima, a Gifu apartment block done around 2000. It's a remarkable low-income housing project that is, as you can see in the plan at the top, it's based not on the unit, but on the room. The structural bay pulls out room. Incidentally, every room has a door to the outdoor arcade. It's a single loaded accommodation. Remarkable to think through what it means with every single room having an exit onto that arcade. Those really subtle kinds of moves, I think are the ones that we really need to look at. There's a kind of modesty about this project, despite the fact that it's done at scale, which has always been appealing. These are, you can see in the photographs, the pass-throughs. Every unit has this kind of pass-through terrace that opens up the block, spread around the buildings. As you can see, it looks like it's random, but it's not. Those are the unit types on the left, where the darker blue are the smallest units, these L-shaped units, and then the T-shaped units and the Z-shaped units. There are essentially four types of different scale and configuration that are then packed together in the way that you see the diagram. We, a long time ago, did an analysis of this project that has nothing to do with the way it was conceived, as far as I know, yet it was productive to the point that we've kind of stuck with it ever since. We took all their types and realized that they're actually part of a continuum. And this is something that, for lack of another descriptor, we call the search space, where you can see that this is a four-way symmetry that actually includes all of the different types that are unit types in section that are in that project. This is the larger set out of which the smaller set that was deployed actually comes from. We asked the question, we sort of generated this and then asked the question, why aren't there any selections, why are so few selections made in the southeast quadrant, the lower right-hand quadrant? And was that an accident? Or was it maybe the fact that they didn't actually draw this kind of space first to see the larger set in which they were working? This is a really simple way to think through variation and selection, which is a model that we move forward with in all of our projects. This is the slab I was just showing. These are the unit types. Using that diagram as a real point of departure, we have these variations. We have 3 unit sizes and 15 unit configurations. Every other floor in the project is shifted, so south-oriented units alternate with north-oriented units. The project is distinguished by its thin section, much like Lovett Hall here on campus, with through units and high ceilings for ventilation and very limited air conditioning. Each unit type in the project has either an exclusive or a shared breezeway, supporting small-scale sociability, which is hard to get in tall projects. And then the cellular construction is followed through with cross-laminated timber panel construction. These are the things that really make the difference. The design here is fairly straightforward. I would say that it's fairly modest. We did much in the same way. We sort of tried to maximize the variation within the larger parameters that I was talking about, and then went about packing up the elevation to get this pretty dynamic mix within what is a pretty static grid-like configuration. You can see the stacked section, balconies on opposite sides, windows on opposite sides. It's open and aerated because of the climate. And this comes from when we looked at the overall type of the slab and the shed, which you see here in the photograph, in the drawing, we did the same kind of spaces for those, where we laid out a table of variation based on something really simple like expand, mirror, rotate, or just copy or move. To come up with these tables, made various selections from them. As you can see, we started working with a third type, the prism, as a way to produce a more flexible version of typical form. The question in all of the work we've done is, how do we get pieces to relate to each other? As opposed to the studio work that I've done in the past, where I tried to get each student to do a different project. We are very different, unique to their own solution outcome of the same program. We're really trying to set ourselves up to do the opposite. How do you develop sympathetic pieces that add up to more than just the sum of the parts? It's a very basic definition of urbanism. And it's really saying, what do we do? If you really want to build a city, then you have to think about typical form. If you don't, you can do individual buildings that relate only to themselves, or let's say to the larger tradition of architecture. But when it comes down to it, you cannot think through urban issues without some form of typical element to relate the pieces and parts. This is the first degree of exploration. That's the second degree of exploration, where we are making selections and then combining the three pieces together. This is a more fluid and forgiving method of typology. It's not like traditional typology, where you're stuck with a Platonic solid or a single volume like a slab or a shed or a tower or a prism. These also have rules of combination, which are absolutely essential in response to contemporary programs. This was our second increment that we wanted to add into to the mix, this prism piece, to make these somewhat self-sustaining. This is a second variant on that prism piece, where we have a slab, which is a kind of background building, recedes in the background as the shed creates the edges of a public plaza that is occupied by the prism. The prism houses a public program intended for the larger public that exists in Willow Waterhole Park. There's a synergy between the slab, the podium, and the prism that we think creates a more complete environment and responds to mixed uses, as opposed to making a simple bedroom community. The next level out, what we started doing is noticing the spatial qualities for reasons that I can't get into for time, which I'm almost out of. We started thinking through the primary ingredient. What binds the modern city together is really space rather than form. We started thinking of these as elements that are integrated not by their formal relationship, although some of them do that, but by the space that they create, and started coming up with these pairs, so that we weren't thinking of these individual slabs in isolation, but always in relationship to each other. As you can see here, this face-to-face relationship between the two of the elements in the foreground, which start to create a space, trying to push, which is the floodplain, which is being evacuated and is being rebuilt along its edge. These two brackets bracket that space, the floodplain space, pull houses out of harm's way, are armored to be able to withstand the floodwaters, and create at a fairly large scale, much larger than traditional urban scale, a public space. There are lots of combinations, and it's a simple matter of making the selections, producing a rhythm. The S modules are intersections. The redevelopment here, the water was being blocked by bridges, so the bridges had to be rebuilt so they wouldn't be obstructions. And what we did is we focused the new construction around those bridges. And this is a key, I'm going to finish with this, the key part of thinking of how an increment can start to have a larger and larger and larger effect, which means it develops over time. And you can see what we more or less laid out as a 10-year transition where we're phasing out existing buildings in pink, clearing them and replacing them with higher density types. And as we move, we have a fairly slow turnover. This may or may not be feasible given the dimensions of the problem that we have. But the idea is that over time, buildings phase out. We can't just throw them away. They need to live out their lifespan, but are replaced with something that makes sense now, that makes sense today. So that, as you can see in this 30-year span, we're actually building 4, 5, 6 new buildings, replacing, taking a lot of the existing fabric out of harm's way, and of building much more densely and economically with these new multi-unit types. That's the overall effect of clearing. Those are the buildings that have been cleared in the middle, and then the replacement of buildings built around that spatial core at the bottom. And these are the units that face out into the existing Willow Water Hole park / storage basin. That is where I'm going to stop since it's 5 minutes to 1. In the 5 minutes, I will show you a 2016 project, which some of you may know, which take the same principles, although I'm not showing it to you the same way I showed you the Westbury Retreat, which I showed it to you, presented it to you from the building up. This one is being presented to you from the overall configuration and transformation of an area of Detroit called Corktown. It is thinking through a model of urbanization that tries to grapple with the carbon cycle by primarily using wood construction. This was done with Jesus Vassallo, Gail Chen, Daniel Kuhn, Chengyun Liu, Peter Stone, and Louis Weiss for the Biennale of that year. But you can see the same patterns of incremental growth. You can see the importance of landscape. These urban forests were thought of as carbon sequestering elements that actually already exist in Detroit. This is the Hans Woodland project. which is a sort of fascinating project. And we put them on a cycle. The buildings have a 50-year cycle lifespan. Carbon capture for trees, depending on the tree, 15 to 25 years. And then there's the occupancy cycle. And what you get is the building cycle and the planting cycle. The planting is cut, the trees are cut for carbon capture, which sequester a lot in their early years. But it's at a different, has a different speed than the building construction. This actually comes from a completely different project done in the Fifth Ward, but it shows the example of urban forestry and how you might start integrating the carbon cycle or the cycle of trees with the cycle of wood buildings. We did a much more extravagant version of the search space, which, since I've already explained it, this is really two of its most important sources: Solowitz, variations of incomplete cubes, and the name really comes from Richard Dawkins, the blind watchmaker. He's the one that came up with search space. It's fascinating if you want to look it up. And just to show you, again, manipulating density, how the increment can expand to have a more encompassing effect and, in effect, transform an entire neighborhood. In this case, this is the increment. And I think it's self-explanatory. It's cross-laminated timber construction. It's a panel system, 3 different widths of the buildings. This one is residential, this one is office, and this is a large public hall for conventions. It's built out of cross-laminated timber modules. And I got my concluding remark from the newspaper this morning, an op-ed by Naomi Klein. And I'll just read it to finish. The late economist Milton Friedman wrote in 1982 about what he saw as the mission of right-wing economists like himself. He is very much the free market fundamentalist. Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function: to develop alternatives to existing policy, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. He was talking about the shift to neoliberalism in the early 70s. This is as close as I can come to a mission statement for present future, which is to keep these alternatives alive until what seem like politically impossible schemes actually become inevitable. And that's my lecture.
Thanks, Albert, for your lecture. I just want to remind attendees that they can submit questions at the bottom of their screen in the Q&A tab. And so our first question comes from an anonymous attendee, and they ask, how do you improve security in a high rise and keep it from becoming a stereotypical urban tenement?
There are lots of high rises that are not tenements. So that I don't think the lack of security is endemic to the type. I do think there are ways to, I mentioned small scale sociability. The way that, it's a hackneyed phrase, eyes on the street, comes from James Jacobs. The ways in which these, the units are oriented and the semi-public pass-through spaces that cut through the block are all intended to sort of open up the internal spaces of the unit. Same with the doors in the Sedgman project, so that I think what a lot of security issues come from is that hard line between the public corridor or the stairwell and the front door. And what we want to do is sort of turn that inside out. You have to think through high-rise living. An elevator lobby is just not enough. And we haven't really confronted that. The sort of gaps and holes that were drilled into those slabs are a sort of a testament to a desire to create levels of sociability that transcend the unit to unit to unit logic that I think is the cause of many security problems.
Okay, our second question is from Jimmy Bullis, and he asks, you talk about the city being composed of space. How do you approach designing or distinguishing space between buildings to be more amenable to public use and occupation than so the Radiant City, for example?
Well, first thing is to recognize the power of space. If you really want to trace the history of the idea of space as the most important component or medium of modern urbanism, you'd have to go back to Mies, but it was more poignantly brought up in 1987 by OMA and their Mellon-Snar project, which I had a plan of, which shows that in a sense, if you can't control the forms, if it's too difficult to create a whole by controlling the forms, you can create that whole by creating space. That space can act as glue to hold forms together, maybe in an even better way than more traditional, say, dense urban centers. Hierarchies hold cities together. You can hold cities together with spaces. The first thing is the recognition of that space is an extraordinary commodity, an extraordinary tool that we can work with to create larger and larger urban configurations. If I make someone, and that's why the spatial armature was developed along the link there, and why from the very beginning we use those slabs to create, to be brackets for what we knew would be a very large, ultimately become a large spatial corridor. But I think that starts with the understanding of what space can do for you, which is that it can create in a non-coercive fashion a larger and larger scale of development, which we can call urban, where the pieces and parts add up, create a whole that is greater than their simple sum. Space can do that. I think IIT campus by Mies, space is the glue, right? That's the idea of that project. And I think it has a legacy. So maybe the way to do it is just to, to sort of be aware of its potential as a medium, see how it's worked before, and try to find the opportunities to build up spaces today. I mean, it's easy. You can go in and say, this developer is going to do his thing. This developer is going to do his thing. This developer is going to do, and they're not talking to each other. But one thing you can do is to build a no-build zone, create a no-build zone, a void, that no matter how cacophonic the voices are in the different developments, they're going to be united by the space that runs between them.
Thanks. Our next question is from Brittany Edding. She says, thank you for your talk. Can you speak a bit about how you imagine processes of phasing in your new studio about wind infrastructures? How does incremental phasing of housing compare to energy? Are you implementing similar models of public-private investment or alternative cooperative models of ownership and maintenance?
Alternative cooperative projects. We're looking at energy co-ops. They exist, and they exist in the wind powered. The idea of trying to, as I was saying at the outset, keep the resources of the county in the county have to do with a co-op that operates locally. So you're in this enormous wind shadow this high wind zone that runs through, in this case, Pecos County. There's a corridor of space that could be built on, whether you are operating in an existing adjacent town, like the one we're looking at called Iran, or you're setting out a new settlement that is based on adjacency to wind turbines, far enough to keep them safe, but close enough to represent the fact that this is an energy cooperative. Now, the government can act as a bank, right? That's a lot of what the New Deal did, and what the TVA did is that the TVA is still exists today. It's a public utility owned by the public, and it is turns a profit, which is nonprofit, but it turns it back into its own operation. The government, it could be realized in a number of different ways with the leverage that we know is possible by government intervention. What we want to figure out is how an activist public sector would work today. We know how it worked in the 30s. We actually know how it actually worked up until the 70s. And I have to throw in, incidentally, that architects had a very different role, played a really different role in those times than they do today. But I think that the ability to leverage resources, even if it's buying small turbines to get a community going, right? Amazing study by Dominic Boyer and Simony Howe in the anthropology department. They studied this phenomenon in Mexico, in the Isthmus, the skinniest part of Mexico, and the different models that were proposed and used. Some failed, some didn't. But there is the legacy of an energy co-op, which I think could grow with the growing production of energy, to the point that it could also begin to sell energy, I think fairly quickly, as these do, outside of their own needs.
Our next question comes from Cohen Hudson. He says, thank you for your presentation, Albert. I was wondering how you understand your project in relation to a discourse of collective living. You use the word density, not collective living, but the two nonetheless imply some level of cohabitation. There's an ecological argument for densification, but is there a social one? Yes.
I think we want to be careful with it, that we tend to be, we tend to think more connection, the better, when the fact is that, many of us don't really know or hang out with our neighbors. But I do think for example, just to use the Westbury example again, that core of space had a largely public dimension to it, as a public amenity, not as a square, not a traditional square or more configured urban center, more along the lines of a park, concentrated, if you notice the slides, at the intersections, where you actually did have more traditional kind of density. What is remarkable about Houston and why we've kept it as a laboratory, use it as a laboratory so much, besides all its problems, is the fact that we have 150 miles of linear park in the public domain in the city. The Bayou Greenways, all the bayous that run in the city limits are now almost exclusively owned by the city. They're public armatures. They aren't developed as such, and they're not even conceived as vigorously and robustly as they could be. But I tend to think that we can, instead of trying to say, follow a model of urban community that was described in, say, Brooklyn, right, with its tight streets and storefronts and public monuments, that there are opportunities for different types of collectivity that make as much sense today as Brooklyn's made in the 18th and 19th century. I think that is one of the values of Houston as a laboratory, is that everyone wants to talk about walkable urbanism, and it's a great thing to have, but we're not going to turn Houston into Brooklyn, and I don't think we really should try to do that. I think these armatures, the bayous, the greenways, are really our version of public space. 60% of the population lives within 1.5 miles of a bayou, which gives me a different sort of a different understanding of walkability, right? And what you're accessing and why you're accessing it, which I think is incredibly exciting. I don't think that the forces that be really appreciate the public potential of the greenways. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but that's what I was talking about with the Willow Water Hole, another SWA project done largely by one of our graduates, Michael Robinson. The Buffalo Bayou Park is an extraordinary space for Houston. You go out there and you can't believe you're in Houston anymore, because of the public dimension that it has, especially on crowded days. So the answer is absolutely, you can't separate out the problem. You can't solve a water problem over here with this budget and then solve, let's say, a social problem over here with this budget, because neither one of those budgets exist. The best chance you have is of combining those things together and making a comprehensive project that focuses both on the environmental issues as well as the social ones in one go, so to speak.
Our next question is from Adam Berman. He asks, can you give some examples of where typical form has been implemented in an urban condition, and if it has been successful? And how do you mediate Latour's notion of caution and care with an incremental urban project?
Okay, the first one is any city up to any central business district in the United States, a city even over 100,000 people up until 1950. I don't know if you remember or know of, don't remember, but you know of the O-shaped, U-shaped, E-shaped, I-shaped buildings that really occupy our central business districts, including Houston. The Rice Hotel is an elaborate E-shaped building. These are building types, and that's an incremental approach, right? The types were made in such a way as to be sure that they, when put together within a single block, that they would work well together and produce more than just individual buildings. So a huge number of, there's a tradition of urbanism that is there to recall. The point being, however, is that you can't borrow. We have changed in the 70 years since we stopped using those typical forms. Our cultural changes have been drastic and they need to be updated, right? We need to think through how we form those greater wholes. I'm talking about where 1 and 1 doesn't equal 2, 1 and 1 equals 4, 1 and 1 equals 5. Two sides of a block make a space in between, that's 1 plus 1 equals 3. The two blocks, space in between, street, public space. We need to update that notion of typical form that would allow us to get these greater surpluses, right? more than just 2. 1 + 1 = 2. And what we're doing is suggesting in a modern context how that would be done. By modern context, I mean contemporary mores. By modern context, I mean the scale of urban construction today, which is way more than a single city block. By modern, I mean the problems that the environmental problems that we know we have to face. All of those, we need another set of tools to work with to get those typical forms. There are not a lot of good examples in modernism, although a lot of them are found examples. We spent a lot of time in Hong Kong in a new town called Shawten, which at a super scale starts to pull its pieces and parts together into a greater whole. I would say that the use of courtyard houses and towers and sheds in Lafayette Park by Mies and Hilbersheimer is a pretty good example of a modern scale of modern buildings, of modern typical forms that relate to each other. Yeah, so that there's a whole world of typical forms. The real problem is trying to figure out how to translate those in contemporary terms. There was a second part of that question, which I completely forgot about.
How do you mediate Latour's notion of caution and care with an incremental urban project?
Because incremental project is caution and care. It is doing one step at a time. It is saying that we don't come in and redesign Westbury tomorrow, do a master plan that's 20 blocks long, and send the bulldozers in on Tuesday to whack it down and build up all at one blow this 20 block axis of space. That, what I was showing you was one potential outcome of the increments that we set up. There, all of the variations that I was showing you in the search spaces were available to be used if different conditions prevail. Say you need a smaller building, say you need a larger one, say you need just a slab and not a shed or a prism. This is an inherent flexibility in the system, that what we are doing is not making a master plan is a composition that is either there or it's not, right? You build it all at once. You can phase it out. Sometimes you can phase it out linearly, but really the whole thing doesn't make any sense until you finish the whole composition, like the Palm Islands in Dubai, right? Incremental growth means that at every stage of the process, the project is complete. And that's how cities were up until the last 50 years. That's how cities were always built, as urban increments. And the flexibility along the way is what gives you the caution, the ability to change. If you lay out a master plan, you're not going to change. The pieces and parts are related to each other in such a way is that they can't change. Because if you screw them up, you screw up the whole project, right? But if you're working incrementally and with a set of forms that can be swapped out, you can make careful local decisions along the way that would be way more responsive, way more cautious, not only to the people who live there today, the people who are going to live there tomorrow, changes in economic fortunes, right? Where's the GDP going? How could that affect? You can't tie that down with the master plan, because you'll end up with something that you're locked into a set of priorities and a set of existing conditions that are inevitably going to change. That flexibility of type allows you to make these local decisions more cautiously, judiciously, right? Instead of imposing a single master plan. That's why I showed it from the beginning with the single building, which I believe stands on its own.
So we have time for just one more question, but we'll make sure you get a list of the full questions in the Q&A.
Oh,
So
thanks.
Zaid Kashef Elgata asks, with so many new cities being built globally, how much attention should be placed on the tabula rasa versus the existing? In addition to what types of explorations of decentralized systems, such as Patrick Abercrombie's polynuclear expansion, are key to establishing new cities?
Okay, polynuclear expansion is, since Abercrombie's time, that has won the day. That is what a megalopolis is polynuclear expansion. Multiple centers instead of a single center, which is what the metropolis was. I don't think we can do anything but polynuclear expansion. I could talk to you about how the spine-based urbanism in some ways makes that inevitable. But I think that so when you look at it closely, especially if you look at it the sort of structural level, the DNA, much of what the planning in the first half of the 20th century did was accomplished. It just wasn't accomplished in the way that we thought it would be accomplished, and not in the way that it could be accomplished to produce better results. And the first part of your question is, where do we start with so much urban construction going on today, where China is building metropolises the size of New York every 2 years, right? You do that by trying to put back together. I mean, it's a little bit the defining civil life that I started out by saying that unregulated markets cannot produce a civil society, and listed out some very basic ontological securities that form a civil society, such as fresh air, shelter, water, health, etc. Until you decommodify cities to the point at which we are able of actually producing a civil society, regulate the forces of construction to the point that a civil society becomes possible, is when I think you'll see changes in the predominant, the enormous amounts of urbanism that are being built in the Middle East, in Asia today. They're still, even though they may have a centralized economy, they're not really maybe the product of a centralized economy. They're no more commodious than what you would get from a Houston developer. In some ways, they're worse. I think that we need to elevate the urban in a way, until we change the way we're thinking about buildings, primarily in cities, that they're not only just an economic pawn. We're not going to get the kinds of fundamental changes that we actually need to make these decent places.
Thank you so much, Albert, for your presentation.
Sure.
I'll pass it over to Dean Kasparian.
Thank you, Albert. This was great. And thank you everyone for attending, and see you next week. Bye.